Hey guys, welcome back. Hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first story is titled, Computer Access Denied. No Nudes for You. I went to college in the mid-90s, back when phones, if you had one, weren't smart, tablets weren't even dreamed of yet, and laptops, while in existence, weren't really attainable for us poor college kids. I, along with a decent chunk of my fellow dorm mates, didn't even have a desktop computer of my own yet. I'd made friends with a couple of guys who shared a room in my dorm, one of whom we'll call N, flipped back and forth between great and annoying as hell. The other we'll call R. He was the nicest, funniest guy ever, and a total tech geek, which meant he had an awesome computer. They pretty much had an open room policy. If one of them was home, the door was propped open, and everyone was welcome, mostly N's doing. At times, this drove R crazy, because while he was fine with an open room, he was not so cool with open computer, and just telling people to stay off it when he wasn't there wasn't working. I was one of a very select few who was allowed on R's computer when he wasn't present, probably because I used it for actual schoolwork instead of surfing porn sites and collecting malware. I also used words like please and thank you every once in a while. Anyway, one day, R dropped by my room, which never happened, and said I needed to come down to his room right now. When we got to his room, R shut the door and explained that he was going to be out of town for a week. Some family issues, if I remember correctly. He knew I'd need to use the computer at some point and wanted to show me a new program he had installed. He had me sit down at the computer and indicated an icon for me to click. It was a slightly blurry, mostly naked lady titled Nudes. I told him I really didn't want to see those, but he said to trust him. When I clicked on the icon, the screen flashed to black and white for a second, then went back to normal color, and nothing. It did nothing after that. I looked at R in confusion. He smiled and told me to try clicking on some other icon. When I went to open something else, the icon ran away from my cursor. I'm not sure if he had written the program or downloaded it from somewhere, but it was hilarious. Once you started the program by clicking on the Nudes icon, the program mimicked the screen until you tried to click on something else. Then it animated the desktop icons and made them all move away from your cursor. It was impossible to click on anything, and even restarting the computer didn't help. R had set the program to run automatically at startup. You had to use a very specific, seemingly random set of keystrokes to shut off the program. When R left for the week, he put a note on his computer saying that only I and one other person were allowed to use the computer while he was gone. I stopped by when he had been gone a little over 24 hours to do some typing. N told me I wouldn't be able to use the computer because he'd done something to it. He was completely freaked out that R was going to blow when he got back. I told him I'd look at it and messed around for a bit playing catch the icon until N was distracted. Then I miraculously fixed the issue, but didn't know what I had done, of course. I finished typing up my assignment while N yelled across the hall that they were all saved because the computer was fixed. I chuckled to myself as I shut down the computer before I went to leave. The next story is titled, Dealing with a Dodgy Competitor. So I work in the construction industry as a project manager and have recently had to deal with a competitor who would cut corners and do shady dealings to get contracts. He would do things like providing kickback to other managers, money exchanging hands, or use standover tactics to get what he wanted. You could go as far as saying he was an all-around bad egg. So earlier in the year, I had put in all the hard yards into designing a specification for a job and going through design meetings with the client. We lost the project at the last minute due to the shady tactics listed above. Now, because of the work and the level of detail I had to put in prior to losing the contract, I knew there were certain items the client wouldn't budge on. One of these non-negotiables, only came from one supplier in the world. Even though it was only worth a couple of cents per item, the client wouldn't budge on an alternative. So, in my pettiness, I called the supplier and ordered all 15,000 of these they had in stock. I also called every other stockist on the website and managed to source a further 5,000, leaving no stock available until late December. So anyways, let's fast forward to this week. The job is close to handover stage, and the competition has done the predictable thing and deviated due to the supply issue. The client came out to inspect and notices they have used an alternative product without approval and has deviated from the contractual agreement. This now has led to massive amounts of rectification work and them being hit with liquidated damage, as the project will now not be delivered on time, costing him close to 300K AUD. The competitor has now been removed from the approved contractors list within my industry and have been escorted from the facility to never return. Not knowing I have 2,000 of this item stashed in my office, and it was me that caused the supply issue. The next story is titled, "I Don't Care If You Made the Trails. It's Still Private Property." So this happened a couple of years ago. I grew up in West Virginia, but I had a grandfather who lived in Pennsylvania. He lived in a pretty forested area with not a lot of neighbors and owned about 27 acres. We would visit my grandfather on most holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, etc. And I would always drive his four-wheeler around the trails in those woods. I knew those trails really well, since I had grown up driving on them. So when my grandfather died, my mom inherited the house and all the land with it. We drove up there within a week to make sure the house was in good livable condition. Still, as we had not been up there for about 3 years before, and my parents were planning on selling it, I decided I would take the old four-wheeler out into the trails to make sure they were clear of debris, so whoever would buy the house and could enjoy the trails like we had. Like I said before, I knew those trails really well. So when I came up to a trail that I had never seen before, I got a little suspicious and decided to go down it. Now, my grandfather had had problems with hunters trespassing before, so his land was very clearly marked with no trespassing signs. Now, after driving down the trail for a couple of minutes, I eventually came into this person's backyard. I decided I'd drive back to my grandfather's house to let my dad know of the random trail leading to this person's backyard and ask him what we should do about it. I got back to my grandfather's house and told my dad about the trail, and he said he wanted to come back down with me to that house to inform them they were trespassing on private land. So my dad drove us back down on the four-wheeler to this trail leading to the house. But on the way there, we were still on my grandfather's property. We passed this maybe 13-year-old kid on an ATV. My dad waved him down and the kid stops. My dad shut off the four-wheeler and informed the kid that he was trespassing on private land. My dad waved him down and the kid stops. My dad shut off the four-wheeler and informed the kid that he was trespassing on private land. The kid, and his snobby little voice said, "But I made these trails, so I should have every right to drive on them." My dad said he still trespassed to make the trails, and just because he made them doesn't give him the right to trespass on our land. The kid replied back with, "Well, I spent all summer on these trails and put a lot of hard work into them, so you should just let me drive on them anyway." My dad told him that he needed to leave right then or he was going to call the police. The kid then let out a long annoyed sigh and said, "Whatever," and took off back towards his house. Later that day, my dad went down the trail to see where my grandfather's property ended and blocked it off with a rope and a very obvious no trespassing sign. We thought that was the end of it, but even later that day, we got a knock on our door. It was the kid and his dad. MD is my dad. ED is entitled dad. ED, my son says you were trespassing on our land and kicked him off his trail. MD, actually your son was trespassing on our land and was very rude when I asked him to leave. ED, but my son made that trail. He has just as much right to be on them as you do. MD, actually no he doesn't. He trespassed to make that trail, and he has absolutely no rights to be on it, ED. But he spent all summer making them and worked really hard. Just let him go on the trails, or I'll call the police. MD, go ahead and call the police. It'll save me a phone call I have to make. Then this entitled dad literally pulls out his cell phone and dials 911 to report people trespassing on his son's trail right in front of us. My dad, being the non-confrontational guy he is, he waits for the police to show up, which takes like 30 minutes because of how far out we are. The moment the police officer steps out of his car, this entitled dad starts yelling at them about how we trespassed on their trail and we should be arrested right then and there. Another officer steps out of the car and walks over to us and asks us what happened. We calmly explain to him the situation, and he goes back to talk with the other officer who is still dealing with the screaming entitled dad. After the officers calmed entitled dad down, they told him they need to leave and not come back or he would be arrested on trespassing charges. The dad is screaming at us and cussing us out the whole time, and his son are walking back to their truck. The dad gets in, starts the truck, and peels out of our driveway. My dad thanks the officers. They leave and we go inside. We never really had any more major problems like that with entitled dad and his son, except for them repeatedly ripping down the rope with the no trespassing sign on it. I almost hoped that the dad and kid would trespass again, so they would get arrested, but we never saw them on the land again. The next story is titled, Unwitting Pawn in Teacher Conflict. Some context. My high school graduating class was about 300 students, so it wasn't small, but it definitely wasn't huge. Many upper grade classes were offered only one section per year. For instance, if you were taking AP English, it was only the 4th period, and you were only one of 25 students taking it that year. AP equals Advanced Placement, which is or nearly so taught at the level of a freshman university course. Students in AP classes could take tests at the end of the year that could, if they scored high enough, be counted as university credit for those freshman level courses. Teachers who taught those classes would teach other classes as well. Frequently, they would round out their teaching assignment with lower grade classes. For example, the teacher who taught AP English would also teach 2 to 3 classes of freshman English, which every freshman had to take, every year as well. Needless to say, most seniors already had all their teachers in previous years. Whenever there was a test in AP English, about half of those students wouldn't be done when class was over. We had 50 minutes per class. No problem, the teacher, I'll call her Sharon because that's her name, is willing to let students stay late to finish up, and she writes hall passes for them to get to their next class, which the teacher of the next class has to honor. Well, for whatever reason, every year, the one AP English class would always occur right before the one AP Calculus class. Maybe some pettiness predated my story. I'm sure you can imagine how annoyed the calculus teacher, Jim, would be on English test days. Calculus class begins. Teacher begins his lecture, and about 20% of the class shows up. 10-ish minutes later, now Jim feels like he has to start over on the lecture. So his class time on these days is effectively shortened by Sharon letting students stay past the end of class. I was far better at math than English, and while I didn't hate Sharon, I got along with my math teacher, including Jim, much more than any other teachers in the school. After one of these English test days, Jim had enough of the BS. He asked me to see him before English class the next day. I show up the next day and he hands me a laptop computer and tells me to sit down, and he has me do some type of busy work. English class starts while I'm sitting in Jim's classroom. 10 minutes go by. 20, 30, 40. He tells me to get my stuff, writes me a hall pass, and then tells me to go to class. I show up with 5 minutes left, hand Sharon my hall pass. She looks at it and tells me to sit down, obviously annoyed by the situation. English test didn't run overtime anymore, although by this time it was nearly the end of the school year, so there weren't many more tests anyway. But wait, there's more. My brother is 5 grades younger than me, so this happened near the end of my brother's 7th grade year. His freshman year began a bit more than a year after I graduated, so fast forward to his freshman year. As I mentioned earlier, Sharon also taught freshman English, so my brother had her. He did not have a class with Jim that year, but on one occasion early in the school year, he had to deliver something to Jim's class in the passing period right before his English class. This delivery caused my brother to be late to English, only by a few minutes, but he showed up with a hall pass signed by Jim. He walked into class, handed Sharon the hall pass, she read it, glared at my brother and said, "Never again," and told him to sit down. My brother at that point didn't know my story, but happened to relay this incident to me sometime later. I nearly died laughing as I told him why Sharon's response to the hall pass had been so unnecessarily harsh. The last story is titled, Park in My Driveway? We'll see about that. Back when I was in high school, let's say about 1966 or 1967, my family lived not too far from Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, where the Rose Parade happens every January 1st. Huge crowds of people showed up, and parking could get congested. One January 1st, someone parked in our driveway. Didn't ask permission, just parked, locked, and left. Fortunately, in those days, car door locks could be opened with a straightened metal clothes hanger. 1 meter long heavy gauge wire with a hook on one end, inserted between the frame and the window, hooked around the lock push button, and the button lifted. So we unlocked the car, pushed it into the middle of the street. Didn't remember having any difficulty with the steering wheel lock, so I guess the car didn't have one. Relocked it and went inside. Should mention that the street had 2 lanes each direction, plus turning lane in the center. The car was left in the turning lane. Car was towed. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you would like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.